The weight of worn fabric. Cressida Thorne walked through the main entrance of Lincoln High School with her shoulders squared and her chin level, even though the backpack on her shoulders was patched with duct tape in 3 places and her sneakers had been resoled twice. The September morning sun caught the faded denim of her jeans, once dark blue, but now bleached to an inconsistent pale color from countless washes, and the flannel shirt she wore had belonged to her older brother before he left for the army 3 years ago. The fabric was soft from wear, thin at the elbows, but clean and carefully pressed. She'd learned years ago that being poor didn't mean being dirty, and she took pride in the small dignities she could control. Lincoln High School occupied a sprawling campus in the heart of suburban Ohio, its red brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard where students gathered between classes. The main building housed the administrative offices, the library, and most of the classrooms, while separate structures contained the gymnasium, the auditorium, and the vocational wings. Cressida had transferred here 2 weeks ago, when her mother finally found steady work at the medical supply warehouse on the east side of town, and she was still learning the layout, still mapping the invisible social territories that every school possessed. She moved through the hallway with an economy of movement that most people didn't notice, keeping close to the lockers, making herself small in the crowd. Other students flowed past in clusters, their voices bouncing off the industrial tile floors and metal lockers in an echoing roar. She caught fragments of conversations about weekend parties, about football tryouts, about who was dating whom, and she felt the familiar distance that poverty created, the invisible wall between her world and theirs. Their clothes carried the sharp creases of newness. Their phones were the latest models. Their backpacks bore brand names she recognized from commercials, and she was acutely aware of how her own possessions marked her as different, as less than, as someone who existed on the margins. Her first class was American history in room 214, and she found a seat in the back corner, the position she always chose, where she could see everyone and no one paid her much attention. The teacher, Mr. Patterson, was a heavy-set man in his 50s who spent the first 15 minutes taking attendance and explaining the syllabus, while Cressida copied the important dates into her notebook, the same spiral-bound notebook she'd been using since last year, its cover decorated with doodles and reinforced with clear packing tape where the cardboard had started to tear. It was in the cafeteria during lunch that first week when she first drew the wrong kind of attention. Lincoln High's cafeteria was a cavernous space with long tables arranged in rows, tall windows along one wall letting in harsh afternoon light, and the constant smell of industrial food and disinfectant. The lunch line moved slowly, and Cressida stood with her tray, calculating whether she could afford the hot meal or if she should stick to the free reduced lunch items, when she felt someone brush past her harder than necessary. "Watch it," a voice said, though Cressida had been standing still. She looked up to see a tall girl with perfectly straightened blonde hair and a face that would have been pretty, if not for the calculating coldness in her eyes. The girl wore designer jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Cressida's entire wardrobe, and she was looking at Cressida the way someone might look at something stuck to the bottom of their shoe. "Sorry," Cressida said automatically, though she had nothing to apologize for. "You should be," the blonde girl said, and her friends laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Cressida paid for her lunch, took her tray to an empty table near the windows, and ate in silence while she watched the social hierarchies play out around her. The blonde girl sat at a central table surrounded by a court of followers, and Cressida learned from overheard conversations that her name was Ashton Carmichael, that her father was some kind of real estate developer who owned half the commercial properties in town, and that she ruled Lincoln High's social scene with an iron fist wrapped in designer labels. The first direct comment came 3 days later. Cressida was at her locker before third period, exchanging her morning books for her afternoon ones, when Ashton and 2 of her friends materialized beside her like a storm front moving in. "Oh my God," Ashton said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry down the hallway. "Is that shirt from this decade?" Cressida felt heat creep up her neck, but she kept her face neutral, kept loading her books into her backpack with steady hands. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. "I think my grandmother had that exact same shirt," one of Ashton's friends said, a girl with dark hair and too much makeup, like in her high school yearbook. "Vintage is very in right now," the third girl added, but her tone made it clear she meant the opposite. Cressida closed her locker, shouldered her backpack, and walked away without responding. Behind her she heard their laughter, bright and cruel, and she felt the familiar weight of humiliation settling over her shoulders like a heavy coat. She'd learned years ago that responding to bullies only fed them, only gave them ammunition, and so she'd perfected the art of becoming invisible, of letting their words slide off her like rain off glass. But invisibility wasn't working at Lincoln High. The comments continued, small cuts throughout that first week. Someone kicked her backpack as she bent to pick up a dropped pen, and when she turned around, 3 students were walking away, laughing. In the bathroom, she overheard girls she didn't know talking about the poor girl in the thrift store clothes, and how someone should start a charity fund. In the cafeteria, Ashton and her friends made a show of moving tables when Cressida sat down anywhere near them, announcing loudly that they needed more space and didn't want to catch anything. Cressida absorbed it all with a calm face and clenched fists, and at night in the small apartment she shared with her mother, she did her homework at the kitchen table and tried not to think about how much easier life would be if they just had money. If her father hadn't died in a training accident when she was 13, if the military death benefits stretched further than they did, if her mother didn't have to work double shifts just to keep them housed and fed. What none of them knew, what Cressida hid behind her second-hand clothes and quiet demeanor, was that her father had been a decorated Marine Corps sergeant, that he'd spent her childhood teaching her to fight with a discipline and precision that turned her body into something more than it appeared. From the time she was 8 years old, she'd trained with him in the garage-turned-gym behind their old house, learning Muay Thai from his years stationed in Thailand, learning boxing from his own father who'd been a Golden Gloves champion, learning that her small frame and slender build were advantages if she knew how to use them. Speed, precision, timing, efficiency. Her father had drilled those principles into her muscle memory until they became as natural as breathing. She'd promised him, in the hospital room where he'd died from injuries sustained when a transport vehicle rolled during a training exercise, that she would never use her skills to hurt people. He'd gripped her hand with what little strength he had left and made her swear that she would only fight to protect herself or others, that she would never become the kind of person who used violence as a first option, that she would be better than that, better than the world that had taken him from her. She'd promised through her tears, and she'd kept that promise even when keeping it felt like dying inside. So she absorbed Ashton's cruelty and the casual meanness of her followers, and she told herself that words couldn't hurt her if she didn't let them, even though that was a lie she'd been telling herself for years. Words hurt. Poverty hurt. Being different hurt. But fighting would hurt worse. Would break her promise to her father, would turn her into something she didn't want to be. The second week of school started with Ashton escalating her campaign. On Monday morning, Cressida found her locker had been vandalized with a crude drawing and the words "Goodwill Girl" written in permanent marker. She spent her lunch period in the bathroom, scrubbing at the marker with paper towels and hand soap until her fingers were raw and most of the ink was gone, leaving only a faint ghost of words that she'd have to see every day. A janitor found her there and helped her finish the job without asking questions, and Cressida thanked him and went to her next class, with her eyes dry and her face composed. On Wednesday, someone tripped her in the hallway outside the gym. She went down hard, her backpack flying, her books scattering across the floor, and she heard laughter as she pushed herself up with scraped palms. When she looked up, Ashton was standing there with her phone out, recording, and Cressida felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She gathered her books in silence, while other students stepped around her, and only one person stopped to help. A guy from her English class, whose name she didn't know, who picked up her history textbook and handed it to her with an apologetic look. "Thanks," Cressida said quietly. "That was messed up," he said, and then he walked away, and Cressida knew he wouldn't help her again, wouldn't risk becoming a target himself. By Friday of the second week, a video of her tripping had made its way through the school's social networks, accompanied by mocking comments and laughing emoji. Cressida didn't have a smartphone, couldn't afford the data plan, but she heard about it from the whispers that followed her through the halls, and saw it in the way people looked at her, their eyes sliding away when she met their gaze. She existed in a bubble of isolation, surrounded by hundreds of students, but utterly alone, and the loneliness was almost worse than the bullying itself. That weekend, Cressida sat in the apartment she shared with her mother and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face looked back at her, sharp-featured and pale, with dark circles under her grey eyes from too little sleep and too much stress. She thought about her father, about the promises she'd made, about whether honor mattered when you were drowning in humiliation. She thought about walking into Lincoln High on Monday and facing another week of cruelty, another 5 days of being a target, and she felt her hands curl into fists without meaning to, muscle memory taking over, her body remembering the countless hours of training, even as her mind tried to suppress it. She forced her hands open, forced herself to breathe, and made a choice to endure. Violence was easy, restraint was hard. She would choose the hard path because her father had taught her that true strength wasn't about hurting people. It was about choosing not to hurt people, even when you could. Monday morning of the third week brought a cold rain that drummed against the apartment windows and turned the world grey. Cressida, dressed in her same rotation of worn clothes, now expanded by 2 items from the thrift store her mother had taken her to over the weekend, a small gift that had made Cressida's throat tight with emotion she couldn't express. The new-to-her items were still obviously second-hand, a pair of jeans only slightly faded, and a sweater with a small snag near the hem, but they were clean and whole, and represented a sacrifice her mother had made from her already stretched paycheck. She wore the new jeans to school and felt something like hope, small and fragile, that maybe the fresh clothes would somehow make a difference, would make her less of a target. That hope died before first period when Ashton spotted her in the main hallway. "New outfit," Ashton said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Still shopping in the clearance section, I see." Her followers laughed on cue, and Cressida kept walking, kept her eyes forward, kept breathing. "I'm serious. It's actually sad," Ashton continued, pitching her voice to Gari. "Like, doesn't she know we have programs for people like her? Charity drives? I'm pretty sure my church does a clothing donation thing." More laughter, sharper now, and Cressida felt her jaw tighten, felt her hands want to curl into fists, felt her body want to turn and face them with all the skills her father had taught her. She imagined it with vivid clarity, the pivot on her back foot, the explosive forward movement, the jab to Ashton's solar plexus that would drop her gasping, the sweep that would take out her knees if she somehow stayed standing. 3 seconds, maybe 4, and Ashton would be on the ground understanding for the first time what real power felt like. Instead, Cressida walked to her American history class and took her seat in the back corner and copied the notes Mr. Patterson wrote on the board, and at lunch she sat alone near the windows and ate her subsidized meal while conversations flowed around her like water around a stone. The cafeteria incident happened on Wednesday of that third week, and it became the moment everything changed, though Cressida didn't know it at the time. She was in the lunch line, waiting her turn, when she felt someone grab her backpack from behind. She turned to find Ashton and her inner circle, 3 girls who were always with her, their faces bright with anticipation of whatever cruelty they'd planned. "Let me see that backpack," Ashton said, yanking it off Cressida's shoulders before she could respond. "I want to check the designer label." "Give it back," Cressida said, her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "Oh, she speaks!" Ashton held the backpack up like a trophy, examining the duct tape patches with exaggerated interest. "Is this the new Gucci collection? Very avant-garde." The cafeteria was watching now, that particular quality of attention that meant something entertaining was happening. Phones coming out, conversations stopping. Cressida stood very still, calculating her options, none of them good. "The craftsmanship is really something," one of Ashton's friends said. A girl named Madison who had perfectly manicured nails and wore a different designer handbag every day. "Is that industrial-grade duct tape, or did you spring for the premium stuff?" "I heard duct tape is like 49 cents a roll," another girl added, this one named Sloane, whose father owned the local car dealership. "So that's what, maybe $2 worth of repairs there?" Practically luxury. The group laughed, and Cressida felt heat crawling up her neck, her scalp prickling with humiliation. Around them, other students were watching with a mixture of amusement and discomfort, that uniquely teenage ability to be both entertained by cruelty and vaguely ashamed of enjoying it. "Please give me my backpack," Cressida said again, and she heard the slight tremor in her voice, the crack in her careful composure. Or what? Ashton stepped closer, invading Cressida's space with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "What are you going to do about it?" Cressida could have done many things. She could have stepped in with her lead foot, disrupted Ashton's balance, taken the backpack with a simple arm drag, and left her stumbling. She could have delivered a short palm strike to Ashton's sternum, nothing that would cause damage, but enough to push her back and establish boundaries. She could have swept Ashton's legs and put her on the cafeteria floor in front of the entire school. Instead, she reached out slowly and took hold of her backpack, pulling it from Ashton's grip with steady pressure. Ashton let it go, surprised by the assertiveness, and Cressida shouldered it and turned back to the lunch line without another word. Behind her, Ashton's voice rang out, "Did everyone see that?" She literally grabbed it out of my hands, so aggressive. "I guess that's what happens when you grow up in—" Cressida spun around, and something in her movement, some quality of controlled violence, made Ashton's words die in her throat. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Cressida saw something flicker in Ashton's eyes. Something that might have been recognition that she was pushing someone who was more dangerous than they appeared. Then the moment passed. Ashton laughed, breaking the tension, and turned to her friends. "Did you see her face? Like she was actually going to do something." Cressida bought her lunch and sat at her usual table, and she didn't taste any of the food she ate, and she thought about promises and honor and how long a person could endure before they broke. That night, Cressida's mother found her sitting on the fire escape outside their apartment window, staring at the city lights spreading below them like a circuit board. Her mother was still in her warehouse uniform, her face lined with exhaustion from a 10-hour shift, but she sat down next to Cressida and wrapped an arm around her shoulders without asking what was wrong. "Your father used to sit out here," her mother said quietly, "when he was home on leave and the apartment felt too small. He said it helped him think." "Did he ever tell you why he taught me to fight?" Cressida asked. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "He said the world was full of people who would try to make you small, and he wanted you to know you didn't have to be small just because other people needed you to be. But he also said that fighting should always be the last choice, not the first one." "What if the last choice is the only one left?" "Then you make sure you can live with yourself afterward," her mother said, She kissed the top of Cressida's head and went inside, leaving her daughter alone with the night and her thoughts. The following Monday marked the beginning of the 4th week, and Cressida walked into Lincoln High with a subtle shift in her posture, her shoulders a fraction straighter, her chin a degree higher. She didn't consciously decide to stop shrinking herself. It happened gradually, a tide turning, an internal balance shifting towards something that felt like the beginning of resistance. Ashton noticed immediately. Predators always noticed when prey stopped running. "Look who's walking tall today," Ashton said as Cressida passed her in the main hallway. "Did you rob a bank over the weekend? Buy some new confidence?" Cressida met her gaze for a moment longer than she had before, then continued to her locker without responding. It was a small thing. Eye contact held for 3 seconds instead of 1, but it registered as a challenge in the complex social calculus of high school hierarchy. By lunch, Ashton had gathered her followers for another public display. Cressida was carrying her tray across the cafeteria when Madison stuck out her foot in an exaggerated motion, making it obvious what she intended. Cressida saw it coming from 3 steps away, saw the malicious grin on Madison's face, saw the phones already out and recording. She adjusted her path by 6 inches, stepped around the extended foot without breaking stride, and continued to her table. Behind her, she heard disappointed laughter and Ashton's voice. She saw that coming like a mile away. What's she got? Eyes in the back of her head. "Maybe she's used to people trying to trip her," Sloane said, and the casual cruelty of that observation, the acknowledgement that they'd been tormenting her for weeks, made something cold and hard crystallize in Cressida's chest. She ate her lunch in silence and spent the rest of the day aware of every person in her peripheral vision, tracking movements and intentions the way her father had taught her, the way soldiers moved through hostile territory. She was done being surprised. She was done being an easy target. That week saw a subtle escalation in the psychological warfare. Ashton and her friends began following Cressida at a distance, not close enough to be called harassment, but present enough to be intimidating, their laughter floating behind her through the halls like a taunt. They whispered to each other when she passed, always loud enough for her to hear fragments. So pathetic. Doesn't she own anything decent? I'd transfer schools if I looked like that. On Thursday, Cressida found a note taped to her locker. Salvation Army called. They want their donations back. She crumpled it without expression and threw it in the trash, aware of Ashton watching from down the hall, waiting for a reaction that Cressida refused to give. Friday brought a new development. Cressida was in the library during her free period, working on an English essay, when someone sat down across from her at the study table. She looked up to find a guy she recognized from her AP English class, tall and lean with sandy hair that fell into his eyes and an easy smile that seemed genuine. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low in deference to the library rules. "You're Cressida, right? We're in Morrison's English class together." "Yeah," she said cautiously, waiting for the punchline, the joke, the moment this turned into another form of mockery. "I'm Hollis," he said, "Hollis Brennan. I was wondering if you understood that essay prompt from yesterday, because I've read it like 5 times, and I'm still not sure what she's asking for." Cressida studied him for signs of deception, but his confusion seemed genuine, and his request was specific enough to be real. "She wants us to analyze the symbolism in the first 3 chapters, specifically how Fitzgerald uses color to represent themes." "Oh," Hollis said, and his face cleared with understanding. "That actually makes sense. I was overthinking it." They spent the next 20 minutes discussing The Great Gatsby, and Hollis turned out to be smart and funny, with genuine insights into the text that surprised her. He'd read it before in another school, and had opinions about Gatsby's character that Cressida found herself debating, defending her own interpretation with an enthusiasm that she'd forgotten she could feel in this place. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Hollis gathered his books and smiled at her. "Thanks for the help. Maybe we could partner up for the next project." "Maybe," Cressida said, non-committal, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Hollis just nodded and headed to his next class, and Cressida packed her own materials with a strange lightness in her chest, a feeling that might have been hope, or might have been the even more dangerous feeling of connection. She saw Hollis again on Monday, and he waved at her in the hallway between classes, a casual greeting that marked her as someone worth acknowledging. Tuesday, he saved her a seat in English class, and they worked together on a paired reading exercise. By Wednesday, when he found her in the cafeteria and asked if he could sit with her, Cressida felt something shift in the school's social landscape, felt attention turning toward them in a new way. Ashton noticed too. "Hollis Brennan," Madison said during lunch on Thursday, her voice pitched to carry across the cafeteria. "What's he doing sitting with Goodwill Girl?" "Maybe he has a charity kink," Sloane said. "Like, gets off on helping the less fortunate." "That's so sad," Ashton said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Someone should warn him that poverty might be contagious." Hollis tensed beside Cressida, his jaw tightening, but she touched his arm lightly. "It's not worth it," she said quietly. "That's bullshit," Hollis said, his voice low and angry. "They can't just—" "They can," Cressida interrupted. "And they will. Responding only makes it worse." But Hollis was the son of a union organizer and a civil rights attorney, and he'd been raised to stand up against injustice in all its forms. He turned in his seat to face Ashton's table. "You know everyone can hear you, right? And you sound like an asshole." The cafeteria went quiet, that sudden silence that meant everyone was listening. Ashton's face flushed, anger and embarrassment warring in her expression. "Excuse me?" she said, standing up. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you sound like an asshole," Hollis repeated louder now. "Bullying someone because of their clothes? That's pathetic. Your dad might own half this town, but that doesn't give you the right to treat people like garbage." Cressida felt panic rising in her chest. This was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid, exactly the kind of attention that would make everything worse. "Hollis, don't," she said urgently, but it was too late. Ashton was moving toward their table, her friends following like a wolf pack, and Cressida felt the familiar calculation happening in her mind without her permission, mapping distances and angles, identifying threats and planning responses. "You have no idea who you're talking to," Ashton said when she reached their table. She was standing over them, using her height advantage, her voice vibrating with rage. "My father donated the money for the new athletic complex. My family has been supporting this school for 3 generations. Who the hell are you to talk to me like that?" "Someone who wasn't raised by assholes," Hollis said, standing up to face her. Ashton slapped him. The sound cracked across the cafeteria like a gunshot, and Hollis's head snapped to the side, a red mark blooming on his cheek. For a moment everyone froze, shocked by the sudden violence, by the line that had just been crossed. Then Cressida was standing, moving between Hollis and Ashton with a speed that surprised everyone, including herself. She didn't touch Ashton, didn't even raise her hands, but something in her stance, some quality of absolute readiness, made Ashton take a step back. "Don't touch him," Cressida said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. "Don't ever touch him." Ashton laughed, but it sounded forced. "Or what? You'll hit me with your goodwill purse?" "Walk away," Cressida said, and there was something in her voice now, some edge of steel that made Ashton's smile falter. "This isn't over," Ashton said, but she was backing up, her friends clustering around her, and they retreated to their table while the cafeteria erupted in whispered conversations. A teacher appeared, Mr. Chen from the math department, asking what had happened. Multiple students confirmed that Ashton had hit Hollis, and Ashton was escorted to the principal's office while Cressida and Hollis were told to remain available for statements. Hollis's cheek was still red, and when Cressida touched it gently, checking for damage, he caught her hand and held it. "Thanks," he said. "Don't thank me," Cressida said. "You just made yourself a target." "I was already a target the moment I sat with you," Hollis said, "and I'm okay with that." They gave their statements to the vice principal, a woman named Mrs. Delgado, who seemed genuinely disturbed by what had happened. Ashton was suspended for 2 days, a slap on the wrist that everyone knew her father would appeal, and Hollis was told to go to the nurse's office, even though he insisted he was fine. That afternoon, Cressida's mother received a phone call from the school. When Cressida got home, her mother was waiting with 2 mugs of tea and a concerned expression. "Tell me what happened," her mother said. Cressida told her everything, starting from the beginning, all the weeks of bullying she'd been hiding, all the humiliation she'd endured, all the cruelty she'd absorbed. Her mother listened without interrupting, her face growing progressively more upset. And when Cressida finished, her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "Why didn't you tell me?" her mother asked, her voice thick. "Because you're working double shifts to keep us housed," Cressida said. "Because you're exhausted all the time. Because I didn't want to add to your problems." "You are never a problem," her mother said fiercely. "Never. Do you understand me?" They sat together as evening darkened into night, and Cressida felt some of the isolation lift, felt less alone than she had in weeks. She told her mother about Hollis, about their conversations, about how he'd stood up for her even knowing it would cost him, and her mother smiled through her tears. "Your father would have liked him," her mother said. "Yeah," Cressida agreed. "He would have." The weekend passed in a strange limbo. Cressida and Hollis texted back and forth, a conversation that ranged from English homework to favorite books to their families, and Cressida found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone since her father died. Hollis told her about his family's history of activism, about growing up in a household where standing up for what was right was considered more important than staying comfortable, and Cressida found herself admitting things she'd never said out loud before about her father's death and the aftermath that had shaped her life. On Sunday evening, Hollis called her instead of texting, and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, and when Cressida finally hung up, her face hurt from smiling. Monday morning of the 6th week, Ashton returned from her suspension with a cold fury that radiated through the hallways like a chill wind. She'd spent 2 days stewing in her anger. Her father's lawyers had managed to reduce the suspension from 5 days to 2, and she was determined to reassert her dominance in the social hierarchy. She started with whispers, a campaign of rumors that spread through the school like a virus. By lunch, everyone was talking about how Cressida had come on to multiple guys who'd all rejected her, how she'd stolen items from the lost and found to wear, how her family was under investigation for welfare fraud. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than the story people wanted to believe, and the story Ashton was selling was designed to destroy. Hollis heard the rumors and came to find Cressida between classes, his face dark with anger. "She's lying," he said. "Everyone knows she's lying." "Does everyone know that?" Cressida asked. "Or are they just entertained by the drama?" By the end of the day, someone had created a fake social media account in Cressida's name, posting desperate messages asking for money and attention, screenshots of which were being shared throughout the school. Cressida reported it to the administrators, who promised to look into it, but the damage was done. She was now a joke, a punchline, the subject of memes being created in real time. That evening, Hollis came to her apartment, the first time she'd let anyone from school see where she lived. He stood in the small living room with its second-hand furniture and carefully maintained cleanliness, and he didn't comment on the obvious poverty, didn't show any judgment or pity, just pulled her into a hug that lasted until she stopped shaking. "We could tell my parents," Hollis said. "My mum's a lawyer." She deals with stuff like this. And make it worse, Cressida said. Give them more ammunition. It can't get worse than this, Hollis said. But he was wrong. Tuesday brought a new level of cruelty. Ashton had recruited more followers, other students who wanted to be on the winning side of the conflict, and they began following Cressida through the halls in groups, mimicking her walk, laughing whenever she spoke in class, making kissing sounds when Hollis was nearby. The teachers saw, but did nothing, either unwilling to intervene or afraid of Ashton's father's influence on the school board. In the cafeteria, someone tripped Cressida as she carried her tray, sending food spilling across the floor. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against the tile, and laughter erupted around her. Hollis helped her up while Ashton's voice carried across the space. Whoops! Someone should teach her how to walk. Oh, wait, we can't afford tutoring for that. Cressida cleaned up the mess with paper towels that a sympathetic cafeteria worker provided, and she refused to look at anyone, refused to acknowledge the phones recording her humiliation, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But inside, something was breaking, some core of restraint that had been holding her together, and she felt it fracturing under the sustained assault. That night, for the first time since her father died, Cressida went to the community gym where he used to train. She paid the $5 visitor fee from her lunch money and spent 2 hours hitting the heavy bag with a precision and power that made other gym members stop and watch. She worked through combinations her father had taught her, movements so deeply ingrained they were automatic, and with each strike she felt some of the anger and frustration bleeding out of her. An old man who was wrapping his hands nearby approached her when she finally stopped, breathing hard, her knuckles red but not damaged from the hand wraps she'd carefully wound. "Who taught you to hit like that?" he asked. "My father," Cressida said. "He's dead now." The old man nodded slowly. "Marines? How did you know?" "Footwork, balance. That's military training, not civilian. My son was Army, lost him in Afghanistan." He held out a gnarled hand. "Name's Frank. I run the boxing program here on weekends if you ever want to work with someone." "I can't afford training," Cressida said honestly. "Who said anything about payment?" Frank said. "Your father gave you something valuable. Be ashamed to let it rust." Cressida shook his hand, and something passed between them, an understanding born of shared loss and shared knowledge of how violence could be both necessary and tragic. Wednesday marked a turning point. Cressida walked into school with her shoulders back and her head high, and when Ashton started to approach her in the main hallway, something in Cressida's eyes made her hesitate. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Ashton felt it like a shift in air pressure before a storm. In English class, Mrs. Morrison assigned a group project, and Cressida ended up partnered with Hollis and 2 other students, a quiet guy named Marcus and a girl named Zoe, who'd been friendly in a cautious way. They gathered at a library table to plan, and Cressida felt the novelty of being part of something collaborative, something approaching normal. "Your analysis of the color symbolism was really good," Zoe said as they divided tasks. "I wouldn't have thought about the green light representing all of that." "Thanks," Cressida said, surprised by the genuine compliment. They worked together for the full period, and Cressida found herself relaxing slightly, letting her guard down by increments. Hollis sat close enough that their shoulders touched, a comfort and a statement, and when Marcus made a joke that got them all laughing, Cressida felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, like maybe she belonged here after all. The moment shattered when they left the library. Ashton was waiting in the hallway with Madison and Sloane, and they blocked the path with deliberate obviousness. "Well, well," Ashton said, "if it isn't the Goodwill gang. Did you coordinate your outfits at the thrift store?" "Move," Hollis said, his voice flat. "Make me," Ashton said, stepping closer, and that's when it happened. Madison, emboldened by Ashton's presence, reached out and grabbed Cressida's backpack, yanking it off her shoulder hard enough to pull her backward. Cressida's body responded before her mind could catch up, pure reflex taking over, and she executed a perfect arm drag that redirected Madison's force and left her stumbling into the lockers with a metallic crash. The hallway went silent. Madison stood there, stunned, looking at her own hands as if they'd betrayed her. Ashton's eyes went wide, and Cressida saw recognition there, saw Ashton understanding for the first time that she'd been pushing someone who could push back. "Don't touch me," Cressida said, her voice absolutely level. "Don't touch my stuff. Don't touch my friends. Are we clear?" Madison nodded, looking scared. Ashton's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, being shown up in front of witnesses, and Cressida knew this wasn't over, knew she'd just escalated a situation that would now spiral toward some inevitable confrontation. But she also felt something else. Relief. She was done being passive. She was done absorbing abuse without response. The promise she'd made to her father would hold, but only up to the point where silence became complicity in her own destruction. That evening, Cressida called Hollis and told him everything. She told him about her father's training, about the promise she'd made, about the skills she'd been hiding for years. She expected him to be shocked, maybe even frightened, but instead he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You've been letting them hurt you," he said, "when you could have stopped it any time." "That's not who I want to be," Cressida said. "Who you want to be is someone who protects themselves," Hollis said, "and I think your father would agree with that." They talked until late, and when Cressida finally went to bed, she slept better than she had in weeks, the decision made, the line drawn, waiting now to see if Ashton would be foolish enough to cross it. Thursday passed in a tense waiting. Ashton and her friends kept their distance, watching Cressida from afar, whispering among themselves. Cressida could feel them planning something, could sense the shift in energy that meant they weren't done, weren't willing to back down, would need to reassert their dominance in some way that removed any doubt about the social hierarchy. Friday brought the setup. Cressida was at her locker after last period, when she received a text from an unknown number. "Hollis hurt. Parking lot. Come now." Her heart seized, fear overriding caution, and she ran. The parking lot was mostly empty, the buses having left, most students gone for the weekend. She found Hollis by his car, and he was fine, confused by her panicked arrival, and that's when she knew it was a trap. Ashton stepped out from between two cars, Madison and Sloane flanking her, and three guys Cressida recognized as football players emerging from the other direction. They'd planned this, orchestrated it, brought overwhelming force to ensure their victory. "Thanks for coming," Ashton said, her smile cold. "We need to have a conversation about boundaries." "Let Hollis leave," Cressida said, positioning herself between him and the approaching group. "Why would I do that?" Ashton said. "He needs to understand what happens when you challenge me, what happens when you defend trash." One of the football players, a massive guy named Brett, who was twice Cressida's size, stepped forward. "This is stupid, Ashton. I'm not going to—" "Your scholarship depends on my father's continued donations to the athletic program," Ashton said without looking at him. "Remember that." Brett stopped moving, trapped by his own financial vulnerability, and Cressida felt rage burning in her chest at the casual way Ashton wielded power over people's lives. "Walk away," Cressida said, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "All of you. This doesn't have to happen." "You're right," Ashton said. "It doesn't. All you have to do is kneel down, apologize for existing, and promise to transfer schools. Simple." Behind her, Hollis made an angry sound, and Cressida put a hand back without looking, a gesture that said, "Stay there. Stay safe." "I'm not doing any of that," Cressida said. "Then we do this the hard way," Ashton said, and she nodded to Madison. Madison came forward, her movements uncertain, clearly not a fighter, but willing to follow orders. She reached for Cressida's shoulder, probably intending to shove or grab, and Cressida moved. She stepped offline, redirected Madison's arm with a simple circular parry, and used her own momentum to send her stumbling past. Madison caught her balance and turned back, shocked, and Cressida remained in a neutral stance, hands loose at her sides, weight balanced. "Stop," Cressida said. "Please stop." Sloane came next, more aggressive, throwing a wild slap at Cressida's face. Cressida ducked under it easily, the movement so smooth it looked choreographed, and came up on Sloane's blind side. She could have countered, could have thrown an elbow to the temple or a knee to the ribs, but instead she just pushed Sloane away with an open palm to the shoulder, sending her stumbling backward. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Cressida said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just leave me alone." "Grab her!" Ashton commanded the football players. "All of you!" Brett and his two teammates exchanged uncomfortable glances. They were big guys, athletes, used to physical contact on the field, but clearly unsure about attacking a girl, especially one who was effortlessly handling the assault so far. "Do it," Ashton said, her voice rising, "or I will personally make sure every one of you loses your spot on the team. Money, power, coercion. The tools Ashton had always used, and they were working." Brett stepped forward reluctantly, and his teammates followed, and Cressida felt her heartbeat slow, felt time stretch, felt her body shifting into the state her father called the combat calm, where everything became clear and simple and mechanical. Brett reached for her with both hands, probably intending to just grab and restrain, and Cressida demonstrated what years of grappling training meant. She controlled his wrist, stepped into his space, disrupting his base, and executed a textbook Osoto Gari, a major outer reaping throw that used Brett's own size against him. He went down hard on the asphalt, the air leaving his lungs in a whoosh, and he stayed down, staring up at the sky in shock. The other two football players hesitated, seeing their largest teammate taken down so effortlessly, and Cressida stood in a fighting stance for the first time, her left foot forward, her hands up in a boxer's guard, her weight on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction. "I trained with a Marine Corps combat instructor for 5 years, she said, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. "I have a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a Golden Gloves boxing qualification. I have been holding back for months because I made a promise to my father not to use violence unless absolutely necessary. You are making it necessary." No one moved. Brett was climbing slowly to his feet, rubbing his back, looking at Cressida with new respect and healthy fear. The other football players were backing away, their hands up in surrender, wanting no part of whatever this was. Ashton stood there, her face pale with rage and disbelief, her entire power structure crumbling in front of her. She'd built her dominance on the expectation that money and social status trumped everything, that victims would stay victims, that the hierarchy was immutable. "You're lying," Ashton said, but her voice shook. "Try me," Cressida said. "Come at me yourself instead of sending others. Let's see who's really weak here." For a long moment they stared at each other across the parking lot, and Cressida saw Ashton calculating, considering, weighing her options. Then Ashton's face twisted with anger. "Brett, Madison, all of you. I want her expelled. She attacked us. We'll tell everyone she started it, that she's violent and dangerous." "We have it on video," Hollis said, holding up his phone. "Every second. You gave the orders, they followed, and Cressida only defended herself." Ashton's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too fast to track. She looked at her friends, at the football players, at everyone who'd followed her orders, and she saw the doubt in their faces, saw them reconsidering their allegiance to someone who'd just led them into a disaster. "This isn't over," Ashton said, the threat hollow now. "My father—" "Your father doesn't own me," Cressida interrupted. "He doesn't own Hollis." He doesn't own anyone here. And you know what? I don't think he even owns you. I think you're just scared that without his money and influence, you're nothing." The words hit like physical blows, and Ashton flinched with each one. Cressida saw tears starting in her eyes, saw the crack in the armor, saw the frightened girl underneath the cruel exterior. "I'm done being scared of you," Cressida continued, her voice softer now but no less firm. "I'm done letting you control my life. And I'm especially done watching you hurt other people who can't defend themselves. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave me alone, leave Hollis alone, leave everyone alone. And if you don't, if you come at me or anyone else again, I won't hold back next time. I won't use just enough force to stop you. I will put you down hard enough that you remember it every time you think about bullying someone. Do you understand?" Ashton nodded, barely, her face crumpling, and then she turned and walked away with jerky, uncoordinated movements. Madison and Sloane hurried after her, and the football players dispersed quickly, Brett pausing to nod at Cressida with something like respect before leaving. Cressida stood there shaking, adrenaline crashing through her system, and Hollis came to her side immediately, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. "I broke my promise," Cressida said, and her voice cracked. "I used violence." "You protected yourself," Hollis said firmly, "and you showed incredible restraint. You could have seriously hurt those guys, and you didn't. You stopped the second they backed off. That's not breaking a promise. That's honoring it in the only way possible." They went to the principal's office together, and Hollis showed them the video. The administrators watched with increasingly serious expressions, seeing the clear evidence of conspiracy and assault, seeing Cressida's measured response, seeing how she'd only used the minimum force necessary at each stage. Mrs. Delgado, the vice principal, looked at Cressida with something like respect. "You have formal training?" "5 years, Cressida confirmed. "My father taught me." "You never reported the bullying," Mrs. Delgado said. "Why?" "Because I thought if I was invisible enough, quiet enough, harmless enough, they'd lose interest," Cressida said. "I was wrong." The school called Ashton's father, called the football players' parents, called everyone involved. By Monday, there would be suspensions and disciplinary hearings and probably lawsuits, given how much money was involved. But Cressida knew the important battle had been won. She'd drawn a line and defended it. She'd shown strength without losing humanity. She'd kept her promise to her father in the only way that mattered, by being the kind of person who used force as a last resort, not a first option. That weekend, Cressida went back to the community gym and found Frank in the boxing section. She worked with him for 3 hours, relearning combinations, working on timing and distance and control. He asked no questions about the bruises on her knuckles or the intensity of her training, just coached her through drills with patient expertise. "Your father taught you defense," Frank said at the end of the session, "but he also taught you something more important. He taught you when not to fight." "I'm not sure I learned that lesson," Cressida said. "You threw a guy twice your size and then helped him up," Frank said. "You stopped the second the threat was over. You learned it just fine." On Sunday evening, Hollis came over and they watched a movie on Cressida's ancient laptop, sitting close together on the worn couch, and when he kissed her gently at the end of the night, it felt like something real and solid and earned, not a romance born of drama, but of genuine connection and shared struggle. Monday morning of the 8th week, Cressida walked into Lincoln High and immediately felt the difference. Students watched her pass with a mixture of awe and caution, but underneath it was something else: respect. Word had spread about the parking lot incident, about how she'd defended herself, about the video showing the truth of what had happened. She was no longer invisible, but she also wasn't a victim. She existed in a new category that the school's social structure hadn't quite figured out how to classify, Ashton was suspended pending investigation, and her friends were scattered, no longer cohesive without their leader. Madison approached Cressida before first period, her eyes red from crying. "I'm sorry," Madison said quietly. I shouldn't have. I'm really sorry." Cressida studied her for a moment, seeing genuine remorse, seeing someone who'd made bad choices because they were scared of being a target themselves. "Apology accepted," Cressida said. "Don't do it again. And next time you see someone being bullied, help them instead of joining in." Madison nodded quickly and hurried away, and Cressida continued to her locker feeling lighter than she had in weeks. In English class, Mrs. Morrison gave her an approving nod, and during the group project work period, other students who'd never spoken to her before asked questions about the assignment, included her in conversations, treated her like a person instead of a problem. It was such a dramatic shift that Cressida felt almost dizzy from it. At lunch, she and Hollis sat at their usual table, but this time they were joined by Zoe and Marcus from their project group, and then by two other students Cressida recognized but had never spoken to, and suddenly she had a table of people, a group, something approaching friends. "Is it true you threw Brett Donovan?" Zoe asked. "Like, actually threw him?" "It's called Osoto Gari," Cressida said. "It's a judo throw." "And yes." "That's the most badass thing I've ever heard," Zoe said admiringly. They ate lunch together, and the conversation ranged from school gossip to plans for the weekend. And Cressida found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time since she'd transferred to Lincoln High. She caught Hollis watching her with a soft smile, and she squeezed his hand under the table, grateful for his presence, grateful for his friendship that had become something more, grateful that he'd been willing to see her when she'd been invisible to everyone else. That afternoon, Cressida was called to Mrs. Delgado's office. She went with some trepidation, unsure what to expect, and found the vice principal sitting with a police officer and a woman from Child Protective Services. "Relax," Mrs. Delgado said immediately, seeing Cressida's panic. "You're not in trouble. We're here because we've been reviewing the full situation, including the months of harassment you endured before the incident last Friday." "Okay," Cressida said cautiously. The police officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, leaned forward. "What happened to you was criminal harassment. The video evidence and witness statements make that clear. Ashton Carmichael and her associates will be facing consequences, including potential criminal charges depending on your family's decision to press charges." "I don't want to press charges," Cressida said immediately. "Are you sure?" the CPS worker asked. "Because what they did was terrible, yes," Cressida interrupted. "But I don't want to spend the next year of my life in court, reliving this over and over. I want to move forward. I want to be done with this." The adults exchanged glances, and Mrs. Delgado nodded slowly. "I understand. The school will be implementing new anti-bullying policies and training for staff. We also want to offer you counseling services, if you'd like them." "I'd like that," Cressida said. "Thank you." The meeting ended with assurances that the school would be monitoring the situation closely, and Cressida left feeling like maybe, finally, the adults were paying attention, were taking responsibility for creating an environment where bullying could flourish. The 9th week brought a tentative new normal. Ashton returned to school after her suspension, and she moved through the hallways like a ghost, avoiding everyone, especially Cressida. Her father's lawyers had managed to reduce the consequences, but the social cost was incalculable. Her friends had abandoned her, other students whispered and pointed, and she'd lost the social status she'd wielded like a weapon. Cressida saw her sitting alone in the cafeteria on Wednesday, and something in her chest twisted with complicated emotions. She thought about walking over, about extending olive branch, about demonstrating that mercy extended beyond the moment of conflict. But she also thought about boundaries, about how forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, about how some bridges once burned needed to stay that way. She didn't approach Ashton, but she didn't take satisfaction in her isolation either. She just let it be, focusing instead on her own life, her own healing, her own forward motion. On Thursday, Cressida received an unexpected visitor. She was in the library during her free period when an older woman approached her table, well-dressed and carrying a leather portfolio. She introduced herself as Judith Carmichael, Ashton's mother. "I won't take much of your time," Mrs. Carmichael said, sitting down without waiting for permission. "I wanted to apologize for my daughter's behavior." "And to thank you." "Thank me," Cressida said, confused. "For not destroying her," Mrs. Carmichael said bluntly. "The video showed clearly that you could have seriously injured her or her friends. You demonstrated remarkable restraint. Most people wouldn't have." "I made a promise to my father," Cressida said. "Your father taught you well," Mrs. Carmichael said. She opened her portfolio and pulled out an envelope. "This is not an attempt to buy your silence or your forgiveness. It's a scholarship fund in your father's name for students who've lost parents in military service. I'd like you to be the first recipient. It will cover books, supplies, and college application fees." Cressida stared at the envelope, her throat tight. "I don't understand." "My daughter became a bully because I let her," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice heavy with regret. "I was so focused on work, on the business, on maintaining our position, that I didn't see what she was becoming. Her father's even worse, teaching her that money solves everything, that people are commodities. Seeing you stand up to her, seeing the strength and discipline you showed, it made me realize what I'd failed to teach my own child." She pushed the envelope across the table. "Please take it. Honor your father's memory. Be the person Ashton wasn't raised to be." Cressida took the envelope with shaking hands, and when she opened it later, alone in the bathroom, she found a check for $5,000 made out to her mother, with "First Year of Thorne Scholarship Fund" in the memo line. She sat on the closed toilet seat and cried, releasing weeks of tension and fear and pain, letting it all flow out until she was empty and clean and ready to begin again. The 10th week brought an unexpected development. Frank, the old boxing coach, approached her at the gym on Saturday with a proposal. "There's a girl in the youth program," he said, 13 years old, getting bullied at her school. Her parents heard about what happened at Lincoln High, heard about you. They're wondering if you'd be willing to talk to her. Cressida met the girl, whose name was Emma, in Frank's office at the gym. Emma was small and scared, with bruises on her arms that she tried to hide and eyes that held the same hunted look Cressida knew from her own mirror. "They said you know how to fight," Emma said quietly. "Can you teach me?" "I can teach you how to defend yourself," Cressida said, "but more importantly, I can teach you that you don't have to accept being a victim, that you have value and deserve respect, and that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't mean fighting. It means being willing to fight if you have no other choice, and that willingness changes everything." She worked with Emma for an hour, teaching her basic defensive stances, showing her how to project confidence through posture and movement, explaining that bullies targeted people they perceived as weak, and that changing that perception was half the battle. When Emma left with her parents, she stood a little taller, and her mother hugged Cressida with tears in her eyes. "You gave her hope," the mother said. "Thank you." Cressida started working at the gym twice a week, helping Frank with the youth program, teaching self-defense classes for kids who needed to feel strong, who needed to know they weren't helpless. It gave her purpose beyond her own struggle, connected her to something larger than herself, and honored her father's memory in a way that felt right and true. At school, Cressida and Hollis's relationship deepened naturally. They studied together, ate lunch together, walked to their cars together, And slowly Cressida learned to let her guard down, to trust that he wouldn't hurt her, wouldn't abandon her, wouldn't use her vulnerability as a weapon. He met her mother and charmed her with his earnest interest in her work and his genuine respect for how she'd raised Cressida alone. He brought flowers, not expensive ones, but picked from his family's garden, and he helped with dishes after dinner, and Cressida watched her mother's face soften with approval. The 11th week brought the final resolution with Ashton. Cressida was at her locker after last period when Ashton approached, moving slowly, her body language submissive rather than aggressive. Cressida tensed automatically, preparing for another confrontation, but Ashton stopped several feet away and raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "I just want to talk," Ashton said. "Please." Cressida nodded cautiously, and Ashton took a shaky breath before speaking. "I'm transferring to another school," she said. "My parents are sending me to a private academy where I'll have more supervision." She said the last word with bitter emphasis. "I'll be gone by winter break, but before I go, I needed to apologize. Really apologize, not just because my therapist says I should." "Okay," Cressida said neutrally. "I was cruel to you for no reason except that it made me feel powerful," Ashton said, her voice thick. "I targeted you because you were different, because you were vulnerable, because hurting you was easy. And I didn't stop even when I could see I was destroying you. I'm not going to make excuses or blame my family or my insecurity or anything else. I did terrible things, and you didn't deserve any of it. I'm sorry." Cressida studied her, looking for signs of manipulation or performance, but Ashton's remorse seemed genuine, her tears real, her shame palpable. "I accept your apology," Cressida said carefully. "But that doesn't mean I forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What you did caused real damage. I still have nightmares about some of the things you said and did. That's going to take time to heal." "I understand," Ashton said, nodding quickly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I know what I did was wrong. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be better, trying to be someone who helps people instead of hurting them." "Then I hope you succeed," Cressida said. "I really do. Because the world has enough bullies. It needs more people who choose to be kind." Ashton left, and Cressida stood by her locker, feeling the weight of the interaction, feeling how complicated forgiveness and justice and growth could be, feeling that maybe the real strength wasn't in fighting or even in restraint, but in allowing people to change while still protecting yourself from further harm. The 12th week brought the Thanksgiving holiday, and Cressida's mother worked double shifts to earn holiday pay, so it was just Cressida alone in the apartment on Thursday with a frozen dinner and a history textbook. She was settled on the couch, trying to focus on the reading, when there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find Hollis standing there with his entire family, his parents, his younger sister, and his grandmother, all of them carrying dishes and containers of food. "Nobody should be alone on Thanksgiving," Hollis's mother said, sweeping into the apartment with maternal authority. "We're having dinner here. I hope you have a table." They did have dinner together, crowded around the small kitchen table that barely fit everyone, eating turkey and stuffing and sweet potatoes and pie, and Hollis's family treated Cressida like she belonged there, like she was already part of them. His father told stories about his union organizing days, his mother asked about Cressida's plans for college, his sister showed her a complicated video game strategy, and his grandmother pulled her aside and said, "That boy is smitten with you. You be good to him." "I will," Cressida promised. When her mother came home after her shift, exhausted and surprised to find the apartment full of people and food, she sat down at the table and cried, overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers who'd become friends. Hollis's family stayed until late, And when they finally left, Cressida hugged each of them, feeling the warmth of community and connection that she'd been missing for so long. The 13th and final week before winter break brought a sense of closure and new beginning. Lincoln High was transformed in subtle ways that accumulated into significant change. The administration had implemented mandatory bullying prevention training for all staff, installed anonymous reporting systems for harassment, and hired 2 additional counselors to provide support for students. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Cressida noticed other changes too. Students who'd been silent bystanders were now speaking up when they saw conflicts. Former outcasts were being included in social groups. The cafeteria felt less like a battlefield and more like what it should be, a place where students ate lunch. She saw Emma, the girl from the gym, walking through the halls one day when she was at Lincoln to pick up some papers, and Emma saw her and waved enthusiastically. She was with a group of friends, laughing, looking nothing like the frightened child Cressida had first met. That simple moment, seeing how one person's courage could ripple outward, made everything worth it. On the last day before break, Mrs. Morrison asked Cressida to stay after English class. When the room was empty, the teacher handed her an envelope. "This is a recommendation letter for your college applications," Mrs. Morrison said. "I wanted to tell you personally that what you did, showing restraint in an impossible situation, demonstrated more maturity and strength than most adults possess. You're going to do remarkable things, Cressida. Don't let anyone make you small again." "I won't," Cressida said, and she meant it. That afternoon, Cressida stood in the main hallway, where Ashton had first mocked her clothes, where the humiliation had begun all those weeks ago. The space looked the same, but felt completely different. Students greeted her as they passed, some with casual waves, others with respectful nods, all of them acknowledging her as someone who belonged, who mattered, who had earned their respect. Hollis found her there, leaning against the lockers, and he kissed her softly before asking, "What are you thinking about?" "How much has changed," Cressida said. "How I almost let them break me. How close I came to either giving up or becoming just like them." "But you didn't," Hollis said. "You found the third option. You stood up without losing who you are." They walked out of Lincoln High together into the December afternoon that was cold but bright with winter sun, and Cressida felt lighter than she had in months. She thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her, about how he'd given her the tools to protect herself, but also the wisdom to use them carefully. She thought about how violence solved nothing, but the willingness to use violence could prevent everything. She thought about how true strength meant knowing when to fight and when to show mercy, when to strike and when to extend a hand. She saw a freshman boy near the parking lot, books scattered on the ground, 2 older students walking away laughing. Without thinking, Cressida changed direction. She walked over and helped the boy gather his things, and when he looked up at her with embarrassed gratitude, she met his eyes directly. "Don't let them make you feel small," she said. "You're worth more than they'll ever understand. And if they give you trouble, find me. I'm Cressida Thorne. I won't let anyone be a victim here anymore." The boy nodded, standing a little straighter, holding his books a little tighter, and Cressida saw in his eyes the same shift she'd felt in herself, that moment when a victim decides to stop accepting victimhood. She rejoined Hollis, and they walked to her car, which was a 20-year-old sedan that barely ran but was hers, bought with money from the scholarship fund and her part-time work at the gym. She drove them to a diner off campus, where they shared fries and talked about college applications and summer plans and all the ordinary, beautiful possibilities of a future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. That night, alone in her room, Cressida wrote a letter to her father. She'd been writing to him in a journal since he died, a one-sided conversation that helped her process grief and fear and growth. This letter was different. This one was about how she'd finally understood what he'd been trying to teach her. "You told me violence should be a last resort," she wrote, "but you never said I should accept abuse. You taught me that strength comes with responsibility, that power means choosing not to use it unnecessarily. I think I finally get it, Dad. Real courage isn't about never being afraid or never fighting back. It's about knowing you could destroy someone and choosing not to. It's about defending yourself without losing your humanity. It's about being strong enough to be merciful. I kept my promise to you. I only fought when I had no other choice, and even then I stopped the second the threat ended. I hope wherever you are, you're proud of who I'm becoming. I'm trying to be the person you raised me to be, even without you here to guide me. I miss you every day, but I'm okay. More than okay. I'm strong. And I finally understand that strength without compassion is just cruelty. And compassion without boundaries is just weakness. You taught me to find the balance. Thank you." She closed the journal and climbed into bed, exhausted but peaceful, and she dreamed of her father standing in the garage where he'd trained her, nodding his approval, his smile proud and sad and full of love. The winter break passed in a blur of work at the gym, time with Hollis and his family, and quiet evenings with her mother. When school resumed in January, Cressida walked into Lincoln High feeling like she'd shed an old skin, like she'd been forged in fire and emerged as something harder and brighter and more resilient. The hallways that had once felt hostile now felt navigable. The students who had once mocked her now treated her with respect, and the teachers who had once ignored her struggles now made efforts to connect, to support, to ensure she knew she wasn't invisible anymore. But the most important change was internal. Cressida no longer walked with her shoulders hunched and her head down, trying to be small and unnoticed. She moved through space with confidence, with the knowledge that she could defend herself if necessary but preferred not to, with the understanding that true strength was a choice she made every day. The choice to be kind when she could be cruel, to be merciful when she could be vengeful, to lift others up rather than tear them down. She saw another student being harassed one day in February, a quiet kid being cornered by two basketball players who thought their athletic status gave them the right to intimidate. Cressida walked over, inserted herself into the situation with a calm presence that radiated, "Don't fuck with me," and the basketball players backed off immediately, recognizing that some battles weren't worth fighting. The quiet kid thanked her with shaking hands, and Cressida gave him her number, told him to reach out if he needed help, offered to show him some basic self-defense moves if he was interested. He took her up on it, and soon she had a small group of students who came to the gym on weekends, learning not just how to fight, but why they shouldn't want to, learning that confidence and skill were deterrents more effective than aggression. Word spread. Other students who'd been bullied, who'd felt powerless, who'd lived in fear, started coming to her, seeking advice or protection, or just the reassurance that someone saw them and cared. Cressida became something she'd never intended to be, a guardian, a mentor, a symbol of what it meant to stand up without becoming a bully yourself. Mrs. Delgado called her into the office one day and asked if she'd be willing to speak at a school assembly about bullying prevention. Cressida agreed, and when she stood on the stage in the auditorium with hundreds of students watching, she felt her father's presence like a hand on her shoulder, supporting her, proud of her. "I transferred here 4 months ago," she began, her voice steady through the microphone. "And for 12 weeks I was bullied relentlessly. I was mocked for my clothes, harassed in the hallways, humiliated in public, and made to feel like I didn't deserve to exist in this space. Many of you watched it happen. Some of you participated. Some of you wanted to help, but were scared to become targets yourselves. I understand that fear. But I'm here to tell you that silence enables cruelty, and bystanders have power." She told them about her training, about the promise she'd made to her father, about how she'd absorbed weeks of abuse because she believed that using violence made you a violent person. She explained how she'd learned that defending yourself wasn't violence, it was justice, and that choosing restraint when you had power was more honorable than never being tested. "I could have seriously hurt the people who attacked me in the parking lot," she said. "I had the skill and the opportunity. But I didn't, because becoming cruel to stop cruelty solves nothing. It just creates more cruelty. The goal isn't to make bullies hurt the way they hurt you. The goal is to make them stop, to draw boundaries, to show them that their behavior has consequences, and then, if they show genuine remorse, to give them a chance to change." She saw students nodding, saw some crying, saw recognition in faces throughout the auditorium that maybe they'd been complicit, maybe they could do better, maybe change was possible. "So here's what I want you to take away from this," Cressida concluded. "If you see someone being bullied, intervene. Tell a teacher. Stand with the victim. Record evidence. Do something, anything, except remain silent. If you're being bullied, know that you don't have to accept it. Report it, fight back if you must, find allies, refuse to be made small. And if you're a bully, understand that you're not strong, you're terrified, and you're trying to hurt others before they hurt you. But there's another path. You can choose to be better, to lift people up instead of tearing them down, to use whatever advantages you have, money, status, strength, to help instead of harm. Everyone in this room has a choice about who they want to be. Choose wisely, because that choice defines your character, and your character is the only thing that's truly yours." The assembly ended with thunderous applause, and afterward, dozens of students approached her with stories of their own bullying, with thanks, with requests for help. Cressida listened to each one, offered what support she could, and felt the weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders like a mantle. This was her father's legacy living through her: protection, strength tempered with mercy, power used in service rather than domination. By the time spring arrived, Lincoln High felt like a different place. The culture hadn't completely changed. Some people were still cruel, some hierarchies still existed, some conflicts still arose. But there was a new awareness, a new accountability, a new understanding that bullying had costs for everyone involved. Cressida's transformation was complete. She no longer wore only second-hand clothes. Between the scholarship fund and her work at the gym, she could afford some new items, though she still mixed them with thrift store finds because poverty had taught her not to waste resources. But more importantly, she no longer defined herself by what she wore or what she lacked. She defined herself by her choices, by her strength and her restraint, by her willingness to stand up and her wisdom to show mercy. Hollis remained by her side, steady and supportive, and their relationship deepened into something real and lasting. They talked about college, about applying to schools near each other, about maintaining their connection even as life pulled them toward new horizons. They were young, and their future was uncertain, but they'd built their foundation on shared values and mutual respect, and that felt solid enough to withstand whatever came. On the last day of the school year, Cressida stood in the parking lot where the confrontation had happened months earlier. The asphalt was the same, the cars were the same, the building was the same, but everything else had changed. She thought about the frightened girl who'd walked into Lincoln High that first September day, trying to be invisible, trying to survive, carrying her father's training like a secret shame. She thought about how that girl had been broken down, piece by piece, until she had no choice but to stand up or disappear entirely. She thought about the moment in the parking lot when she'd made her stand, when she'd revealed her hidden strength and shown mercy in victory, when she'd chosen to be better than her bullies, even when being worse would have been easier and more satisfying. That moment had defined her, had set her on a path toward becoming someone her father would be proud of, someone she could be proud of. Hollis came up beside her, slipping his hand into hers, and together they looked at the spot where Brett had fallen, where Ashton had crumbled, where Cressida had chosen compassion over cruelty. "What are you thinking?" Hollis asked. "That I'm glad it happened," Cressida said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Not the bullying, not the pain, but the test. The chance to find out who I really am. The opportunity to honor my father's lessons in a real way, not just in theory. I'm glad I know now that I'm strong enough to be kind. That's worth more than never being tested." "You're going to change a lot of lives," Hollis said. "You already have." "We'll see," Cressida said. But she believed it. She'd seen the ripples spreading outward from her choices, seen other students standing up for themselves and each other, seen a culture beginning to shift. Change was slow and imperfect and required constant effort, but it was possible. People could grow. Schools could improve. Victims could become victors without becoming villains. They walked to their cars, and Cressida paused at her old sedan, the one she'd bought with scholarship money and sweat equity. She remembered being ashamed of it those first weeks, parking far from the entrance so no one would see the rust and the dents. Now she parked wherever she wanted, because she'd learned that a car was just transportation, that clothes were just fabric, that possessions were poor measures of worth. What mattered was character. What mattered was how you treated people. What mattered was the choice you made when you had power. To use it to hurt, or to use it to help, or to choose not to use it at all and let mercy be your strength. She drove home to her mother, who was waiting with dinner and questions about the last day of school, and Cressida told her everything. She told her about the speech, about the students who'd thanked her, about the teachers who'd praised her courage, about how the principal had mentioned her in his year-end address as an example of student leadership. Her mother cried, as she often did these days, tears of pride and relief and grief for the husband who'd taught their daughter so well. That night, Cressida wrote the final entry in her journal to her father. "I did it, Dad," she wrote. "I kept my promise. I used the skills you taught me only when I had no other choice, and even then I showed restraint. I could have hurt people badly, could have used my training to dominate and intimidate and take revenge for all the pain they caused me. But I didn't. I defended myself. I drew boundaries. And then I showed mercy. I helped the girl who attacked me understand she could be better. I gave my bully a chance to change, and she took it. I'm not saying I'm perfect or that I always made the right choices, but I tried to honor what you taught me. That real strength is knowing when not to fight. That power means responsibility. That mercy is harder and more valuable than vengeance. I miss you every single day, but I carry you with me in everything I do. You made me strong, but more importantly, you made me kind. Thank you for that gift. Thank you for teaching me that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive, that the strongest people are often the gentlest, that true warriors know when to sheath their swords. I'm going to keep trying to be the person you raised me to be, strong enough to protect the weak, confident enough to show vulnerability, and wise enough to know that the greatest victory is the battle you win without fighting. I love you. I'll make you proud." She closed the journal for the last time, feeling a sense of completion, of circle closing, of one chapter ending and another beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to choose who she wanted to be. But tonight, she was at peace with who she was, with the journey that had forged her, with the scars and the lessons and the hard-won wisdom. Cressida Thorne had walked into Lincoln High as a victim, survived as a fighter, and emerged as something rarer and more valuable. A protector who understood that true strength meant having the power to hurt others and choosing every single day not to. She'd learned that mercy wasn't weakness, that restraint wasn't cowardice, that standing up for yourself didn't require losing your humanity. She'd learned that bullies were often victims themselves, that cruelty was usually born from fear, that giving people a chance to change was both dangerous and necessary. Most importantly, she'd learned that her father's lessons weren't about fighting. They were about living with honor in a world that often demanded dishonor, about maintaining your values when everything pushed you to abandon them, about being kind in a world that rewarded cruelty. And as she lay in her bed, in the apartment that had once felt too small and too poor, but now felt like home, she understood that this was what her father had wanted for her all along, not to be the strongest fighter or the most skilled warrior, but to be someone who used strength in service of something greater than herself, someone who protected rather than dominated, someone who chose mercy over vengeance, even when vengeance would be easier and more satisfying. The worn clothes that had marked her as a target, that had made her vulnerable to cruelty, had taught her something valuable, that a person's worth had nothing to do with what they owned or wore, everything to do with how they treated others when they had power over them. She would never forget that lesson. She would carry it forward into every interaction, every conflict, every moment when she had a choice between kindness and cruelty, between mercy and vengeance, between using her strength to hurt or to help. Cressida closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and she dreamed of walking through hallways that held no fear, of defending students who couldn't defend themselves, of teaching others the lessons her father had taught her, of spreading the understanding that true strength was a gift that demanded responsibility, that power was a test of character, that the measure of a person wasn't how hard they could hit, but how often they chose not to. She dreamed of a better world, built one choice at a time, one act of mercy at a time, one refusal to become cruel, even when cruelty would be justified. And in her dreams, her father was there, watching with that proud smile she remembered so well, nodding his approval at the woman his daughter had become, strong enough to fight, wise enough not to, and brave enough to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. That was his legacy, that was her inheritance, that was the gift he'd given her, wrapped in years of training and sacrifice and love, and she would honor it for the rest of her life, one choice at a time, choosing mercy over vengeance, choosing protection over domination, choosing to be the kind of strong that made the world a little bit better, a little bit kinder, a little bit safer for everyone who'd ever felt small or powerless or alone. Because that was what real strength meant. That was what her father had taught her, and that was who Cressida Thorne had chosen to become.